Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Schumacher, and I am the new curator of Native American life and history here at Connor Prairie. Welcome to the first Curious Conversations live event. During our live program, we would like to know what questions you have, so please feel free to leave them in the chat at any time. I will be providing context to the conversation and answering your questions along the way. While we weren't able to get all of our guests here to be live, we will be hearing from 3 Lenape elders answering some questions we asked them when we visited them last month. We wanted to make sure that the explanations of the clothing came from the people and the community that it's from. Today we will be discussing how textile objects serve as connections to culture, community, and history. They are forms of material culture, physical forms of personal, cultural, and artistic expression. These pieces do not remain static, but can change over time as the individuals and their cultures do. Connor Prairie is excited to provide a platform and forum for Mike Pace, Annette Ketchum, and Paula Pachonik, our partners, consultants, and experts from the Delaware Tribe of Indians, to share their material culture with our audience today. Many members of the Delaware Tribe of Indians also identify by their own name for their nation, Lenape. The start of this live series, Curious Conversations, we wanted to start by focusing on an area that is interpreted on the grounds but doesn't get the breadth and representation it often deserves. The Lenape area and the material culture of the Lenape, as shared with us by Lenape elders Mike, Annette, and Paula. When most people think of museums and objects, they often think of the objects behind glass on pedestals with labels. This form of display can be beneficial, but does not work well in all non-traditional forms of museums like Connor Prairie. Today, we will discuss a different way to teach and learn about the past and present through objects as material culture. Material culture can be implemented in ways that are less clear at first glance, but provide opportunities for interpretation, such as furnishing, utensils, tools, toys, and clothes, both as historical collections and reproductions. Connor Prairie utilizes clothing as a form of interpretation in several places on the grounds. However, the role of traditional dress and regalia is a separate category of material culture, which can provide educational opportunities without falling into the role of costuming. Material culture, as specific to Indigenous cultures, is not a costume. A costume can function as its own form of material culture, reflecting on the cultural in-group utilization, but the material culture we will discuss is not the same as historical clothing and costuming. Today we ask, how does clothing help tell the story of a person? How does material culture connect the individual to the culture, community, and history? How can it help share that connection? To answer these questions and to share their knowledge, we have pre-recorded interviews with Mike Pace, Annette Ketchum, and Paula Pachonik. Mike Pace is the former assistant chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians. He served on the tribal council several times and has been the economic developer and head of cultural preservation for the tribe. He is currently an interpreter specialist for Connor Prairie, helping us teach about his culture as well as the many others that were present in the state. Annette Ketchum is a former tribal council member and has served as the Cultural Preservation Committee and newspaper committees. She is currently involved in the Bartlesville Indian Women's Club. Her husband, Dee Ketchum, was chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians from 1998 to 2002. Paula Pachonik is the first woman to be elected chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians and has served on the tribal council as well as the trust board. She's also involved in the Delaware Indian newspaper as well as the Bartlesville Indian Women's Club. Bear with us, the transition between clips will be a bit awkward, but we wanted to let these experts speak and share with us as much as possible today. Our first question will go to Mike Pace. What materials and objects are part of Native American material culture?
Each tribe, like the Delaware tribe or the Lenape as we call ourselves, all tribes developed different. They all developed in different areas of the country where there were quite different resources from one part of the country to the other. We had to learn to adapt to where we are, sometimes where we were forced to move. And in order to do that, you have to adapt to your surroundings. Therefore, even the animals, the type of growth that goes on there, the foodways, the things that you use to live and survive are all different in many areas. Because of that, the things that you use for your traditional art is based on your environment. So all tribes basically living in different environments have their own art, their own culture, their own way of expressing that. Because through your culture, through the environment in which you live, that's exactly how you survive as a culture.
We then asked Mike to elaborate a little bit about how this art is passed on.
Traditional art is not only done through saving and reproducing artifacts, but some of the original artifacts need to be passed down. The skills that you have developed need to be done orally or physically, showing how to pass on those things. As elders, it's our privilege to pass on the skills that we possess, that we have to pass on to our youth. So not only the physical use of those things that we have created and wish to pass on and to have copied, and then to have altered in some way to match the present use. All art, all things evolve, and art is something so important. But to be able to retain the art of your particular tribe is of great importance.
Mike mentioned there at the end a little bit about how art has changed over time, so we asked him to elaborate more about the evolution of art.
The tribes today have many different ways to create the art that they use. For example, the clothing that you would be using. In earlier times, of course, the clothing was based on buckskin, maybe elk hide. With the advent of the fur trade on the East Coast, you were introduced to cotton cloth, wool cloth, maybe gabardine, maybe even silk or satin in some cases. And the use of each one of those helps to create different color schemes, different ways to create your traditional clothing in a new and different way. This is how tribes evolve their art, from primitive to extremely complex. So we try to make sure we do that. That's strictly clothing. We have not talked about beadwork. Beadwork was introduced to us because at first we actually made our own beads to create patterns. Beads were used to create belts, sashes, straps, necklaces, earrings. The first earrings and the first use of kiok, as we would call it in Lenape, was the use of a quahog seashell, where we would actually crack the shell, shape, cut, drill it, and sew it together to create necklaces, bracelets, armbands. But it was all handmade, and it was all done one bead at a time. We could also use carved wood beads that were called runties, but still one bead at a time, carved, painted, and drilled, then sewn together. You could also use carved wood beads, or actually carved clay beads rather. The clay beads were made the same way, shaped, formed, fired, drilled, painted, then sewn together. They work quite well. And of course, with the advent of other glass beads that came from Europe through the fur trade, you had many different ways to express your art through beadwork. And of course, the advent of the cloth, the colors that were brought through satin, silk, even the cotton cloth was a way of reproducing ribbon work. The ribbon work was done many layers of ribbon work to create those patterns that you could use not only for leggings, for breech clips, also using for women's wraparound skirts. All tribes had a different way of expressing their ribbon work that way. Even the clothing And not only the clothing, but also the moccasins that you wear. All tribes have different ways of doing their moccasins. You have center cuts, you have pull-ups, you have side stitch. There are many, many different ways. The Delaware used a pulled-up toe and covered with beadwork with ribbon work on the side. Very unique, soft-soled for woodland tribes. Hard soles were used out for the plains tribes who were working much harsher places, rock and gravel, things like that were detrimental to those shoes. So you had many different ways of creating those. But of course, the ribbon work, the style of beadwork, the style of ribbon work you do on those moccasins were also indicative of specific tribes. And so with all those different resources, looking at tribal people today, you can actually still tell what tribe they are simply by their beadwork, their ribbon work, their traditional clothing, even their headwear. Some tribes used what we call roaches, which were horsehair and porcupine hair that were sewn together to stand up straight and then tied on top of your head. Other tribes used turbans, which were made from otter hide that was sewn directly to satin pieces and then decorated with beadwork. So with all of those different ways to create your clothing, all tribes were able to create their own style, their own designs, and you could actually tell the difference between each one of those tribes.
We then talked to Annette a little bit about how traditional dress evolved specifically for women's clothing.
Originally, these clothes looked the same shape they look now. If you go to a museum from the 1700s, the blouse was still made they look like this. Had the collar, the long sleeves, cuff, and the skirt was wrap around with ribbon work on it. But they may have had quill work or some other kind of work on the skirt. I didn't see a lot of skirts that survived, and maybe they used them for blankets and they wore out. But the blouses did, and they were just like this. But the way they've evolved is the way they decorate them today, because there's a lack of the same kind of product or the same kind of decorations that they had in those days and what they have today. I think that probably our ancestors used a lot more shells maybe and dried seeds and things that we don't have access to. We don't know how to dry the seed or make it usable, to make a bead out of it. But I have old beads like that because but they're strung into necklaces. They're not sewn on the clothes. They could be, though. They could be clothes.
We then asked Paula to elaborate a little bit more specifically about ribbon work.
This skirt, now this is a fancy one. The ribbon work on it, there's 9 layers of cloth. It's different than applique because you cut down through the material to get the design and the colors. And which is kind of tedious work, but anyway, that's my effort to do the ribbon work. And the blankets that started out, you made your skirts out of the blankets, the wool blankets, the leggings to match, and you wanted to keep all covered up.
We then asked Mike to talk a little bit about the wampum.
When we were using wampum beads to create patterns for our designs, tribes, northeastern tribes, woodland tribes, had different symbols and designs they would wear in their clothing to signify what tribe you were. The Delaware, with the use of wampum beads, which were simply seashells shaped into long tubular beads, when we created those, simply because there's only 2 colors in a shell, kind of a deep purple and that pearlescent white, you had to use opposing colors with different designs. Those designs were representative of the tribe. So the figures and the designs that we use in the belt would tell you what tribe you were dealing with. So the Delaware usually had large wide belts that were worn diagonally across your shoulder to your waist, and several times they used fully beaded belts. And the designs in there signified certain tribes. Wampum beads eventually became used, of course, as wampum belts, in which treaties were designed. And the reason for that is tribes didn't have anybody who could read or write French, English, and so in the creation of treaty agreements between those groups and the tribe, they had to have a way for the tribes to understand what those treaties meant. So they used wampum belts, varying widths and lengths, to draw a picture of a treaty in a belt. And the use of those is how tribes were able to understand what each treaty was about, not being able to read an actual written version of those. Wampum beads, actually, because you needed so many of them at the time, to make a 5 or 6 foot wampum belt about a treaty may take as many as 7,000 beads. In that instance, considering that by hand, best bead makers could only make 3 wampum beads in a day, it takes a while to get that amount of beads. Because of that, the tribes were able to bring wampum beads in from many different resources, and wampum beads at that colonial period in history actually became a form of money. You could exchange your wampum beads for trade goods and things like that because it took so many. But of course, the use of glass beads coming from Eastern Europe, which the old timers, we still call them check beads, that's where they came from at that point. We still use those to express our history, language, and culture in beadwork. And of course, ribbon work, it's done the same way.
So Mike mentioned there the images created by the wampum beads in the overall belt had meaning both to the people who were making them and to the people who were receiving them. So we asked him to elaborate a bit more about any specific colors or design schemes that meant that had great importance specifically to the Lenape people.
The Lenape tribe actually used red and black as a tribal color. And actually, there are quite many tribes that use that because it simply meant life and death. But the patterns that you use, either with Missing was really the keeper of the animal. Sometimes the ribbon work was done with birds. It was done with diagonal diamond shapes. There were many different ways that tribes used that to distinguish itself. For example, among the Miami tribe, they liked diamond shapes. They incorporated diamond shapes of all sizes, shapes, colors within their beadwork and their ribbon work. You could look at that. You could pretty well say that's probably Miami. Delaware used more two-color designs, using an opposing color like black and white, maybe red and yellow. The opposing colors make your designs pop out. And of course, the designs were simply mostly an object or maybe just geometric, but they would be specific to a tribe.
So Mike mentions a lot of different pieces, as has Annette and Paula. But then we wanted them to talk about specifically when and where you'd see these traditional forms of material culture being worn.
The use of your beadwork can be worn at any time for any use. Beadwork can be used in any form, either as earrings, as everyday belts, necklaces, Any kind of use you could use for everyday wear is possible. The use of your ceremonial dress is used usually in tribal dance, intertribal powwows, where you're actually using your traditional clothing to wear. For men, they would be wearing sashes, the straps, hangs. You could also use that beadwork for knee ties. Moccasins are also beaded up and covered with ribbon work and satin. So there are quite a few ways to use those things, either every day or in ceremonial dance.
So we want to keep talking about traditional material culture, but we do have a question in the chat asking who the two people are behind Mike. We actually have a video clip for that as well.
Today, I happen to be among my own relatives. Behind me, I have a picture of Charlie Elcare, who was born in the 1850s in Kansas. He was the last ceremonial chief of the Delaware tribe. He ran the big house ceremony, of which he was the leader of that. On the other side to the chief's left there would be a great-grandmother who is doing a traditional ribbon work. The Delaware used narrow ribbon work in diamond shapes and usually put 5 to 6 rows of diamonds, but of different colors for the next row. But they did more straps, but they weren't limited to that. Of course, all ribbon work is different. Even within the tribe, families had their own specific ribbon work that they did, specific to them, but it was also specific to the tribes using those tribal colors.
So we then asked Annette and Paula to talk a little bit about their traditional blouses that they're wearing in those clips that you can see.
And this blouse, like I said, it's very difficult to make. I will show you the back of it. One of the things you can always tell, it has a moon. That is called a moon. And if you see a blouse, a collar that doesn't have the moon, you know that the girl didn't know how to do it. This is, there's no, you can see it's sewn right on there. You have to turn it over, and then you have to flip the collar to get that on there like that. Otherwise, what they do, they just take the collar and the thing, and they end up putting a piece of tape, bias tape around here to keep it together. But that's not the way the original Delaware is. Also, they put the gusset in here. There's a gusset under the arm. And the cuffs. Now, I make my cuffs. I don't put elastic in them, and I can snap it and get it to fit my wrist without having elastic. I started doing that because the little kids can't stand elastic on them, and I like it that way too. I like to be able to unhook it. The blouses are decorated, and this one's decorated with what we call buttons. They're like a little bitty concho. The blouses, they have washers or buttons. Those are the two different ways we decorate them. Some people put beads on them. Just depends on what you have and what you can afford to. There's pictures in museums that this literally covered with washers. And the old people put those on, that German silver, and I don't know how they made them or what. And we have some. I have another blouse that has the washers on it, but I don't have thousands of them. But my sister has a lot more washers because her husband was making the washers.
Now this is really a traditional blouse. This is the way the ladies made the blouses. Well, they had to get the cloth first. So of course the Europeans came with the cloth, and with the ruffles and it was actually we didn't wear tops for years, but this was more or less for modesty's sake, and of course the pilgrims and people we came in contact first, they had on, they were covered, all covered up. And so if we wanted to go anywhere and be decent, then we had to wear clothes. And but it's utilitarian in that you could, this was just like a cape that you could nurse your babies. And
So Paula mentions there about getting the cloth from the Europeans. So prior to European contact, the Lenape people were in Lenape Hoking, which is their native lands, and traditional tops were worn by men, but not necessarily women, including cloaks and whatnot. As white people became more common, more Europeans came to North America and interacted with the Lenape people. Different tops became more popular. So the clothing she's talking about there are different silk and cotton-based fibers rather than traditional clothing fibers that would have been worn by other indigenous cultures in the area. And our next clip is about Annette's hair bow, that long ribbon thing that she's wearing in that video. That's her hair bow. We're going to clip that for you next.
This is what they call an acipalawan, a hair bow and trailer. This is the broadcloth, the wool, and that's how it's decorated. It's one of my daughters. This hair bow is the hair bow, and then this is the trailer. And it's just made out of rows and rows of ribbon and then decorated. You can put things on here. My daughter hasn't put anything on here, and I never did either to fix that up. We use a lot of turtles because we're Turtle Clan. But we kind of have a color scheme going. We have blue, green, yellow, and red. Those 4 colors. And the reason we chose those is because way back I found this belt that my grandmother made, and that's the colors it had on it. And then I found some ribbon work that Aunt Anna made, same color scheme. So I said, well, that must be our family color scheme. And so I've made all of the men's outfits like that, put that color scheme on it. And we use that a lot.
So Annette mentions that color scheme there. She's also wearing moccasins and a shawl that aren't really visible in previous clips, but we've got another clip of her describing them for us, which also fit that same color scheme.
The moccasins, they're soft soled. You can tell a woodland tribe by the soft soled moccasin. The toes are beaded, and the flaps are covered with, this one has the same ribbon work pattern. The other thing we carry is a dance shawl. A dance shawl is, we can wear this if it gets cold, we can put the shawl on. And this has the ribbon work all across there. This is a really good example. Now, a lot of times we make these shawls, we put an applique of some sort right in the center. I got lots of shawls back there, and every one of them's different. You know, they don't ever make 2 shawls exactly alike.
Annette's also got a specific purse that goes with this outfit as well, that we asked her to talk about for us as well.
Dutch people came over here, and they were in Pennsylvania, and the Delaware saw this. There's 2 different styles, and this is just one style. The pattern is this one panel. You take these 6 and make 6 of them just like that. Then you sew them together, and you do a wrap stitch. That's just wrap that beads around and around. I've got some other examples of this too. And then I painted these panels. This is one of the first bags I made for myself. And this is just, it's painted with magic marker. And then I just bead it around, an outline stitch around each pattern. And these are those stylized woodland flowers. And each panel has a different flower on it. And then I put this hanging down. Now the other style is you put this fringe and hang it down out of here, out of the sides of these sides. But the point is, this is the way the tulip purse looks. It always is like a tulip. And the little bulb and then the petals on it.
So all of the traditional dress and regalia that we've mentioned so far today would be worn not only during powwows, which are sometimes intertribal or tribe-specific get-togethers, but also specific ceremonial events as well. We asked Paula and Mike to talk a little bit about some of the uses of eagles during those ceremonial events?
We use pretty much all of it because you want the fluffs, the small end pieces that fit in for your fans. Also, you even use the bones. We make bone whistles out of that. It's more of a northern traditional thing, but we did the same thing with making those bone whistles out. So we're really basically using the whole thing. The claws can be put on dance sticks, or you can actually make necklaces out of just the claws, the talons on those, or even staffs. We use eagle heads for those.
And the Delaware, the Lenape people were fonder of the golden eagle than the bald eagle.
So you can see there Mike's holding a pretty large fan made of eagle feathers. So we asked Mike and Paula to elaborate a little bit more about dance fans versus larger fans.
Here's my fan. It got used for a lot of things too. Keep that light out of your eyes. Fan your babies, fan yourself. And if it was a wing, then it really moved the air.
To the Delaware, the eagle was the bird that flew the highest and was the most powerful bird to us. And we always believed when we were doing our ceremonies with our white cedar, smoking off for blessing ceremonies, naming ceremonies, that our prayers were carried on the smoke, and the eagle made sure that it was taken all the way to the Creator. So we always treat these with a great deal of respect. Don't even let them fall on the ground. You always take very good care of them. And of course today the eagle is a protected species now. In the few years ago, it was a animal that was almost extinct. But it was brought back, and so it was taken off the endangered species list. And today it's a protected thing. But it's still illegal to shoot eagles or even to use the feathers or even sell them. If you try to sell an eagle feather for a good price, and get caught, you probably would be spending 10 years in federal prison. So that's why we take such great care of it. They have great meaning to us, so we use them not only, as Paula said, as an air conditioner, but you also use it in all your ceremonial activities. It's something we've been using for hundreds of years, and so it's part of who we are and how we treat the environment, how we treat ourselves, and how we dress. It's part of who we are.
All right. We got a couple questions in the chat. One of them was to explain again who Annette and Paula are. So Annette Ketchum is a former tribal council member and has served on the Cultural Preservation Committee and the newspaper committees. She is currently involved with the Bartlesville Indian Women's Club, and her husband Dee Ketchum was chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians from 1998 to 2002. Paula Pachonik is the first woman to be elected chief of the Delaware Tribe of Indians and has served on the tribal council as well as the trust board. She's also involved in the Delaware Indian newspaper as well as the Bartlesville Indian Women's Club. We also have a few more questions in chat. Is it hard to make the clothes? Do they make them their own clothes? How did they learn to make them? And do they wear any special clothes for rainy or cold days? So some pieces are harder to make than others. It depends on the designs you want to do. If you have a pattern to go off of, it's easier. But most of the time, you are taught by either a family member or a community elder. These people mostly made their own clothes, and they learned from their parents or grandparents or other relatives who are part of the tribe. Do they wear any special clothes for rainy or cold days? There's additional layers you can put on top. So Annette mentioned her shawl. You can wear that on particularly cold days. There's also colder weather cloaks and larger skirts that can be used as blankets. So a skirt can be unpinned at the hip and then used as a full body wrap, like a big fluffy blanket to keep people warm on cold days. Another person asked, where do they find the shells that they use for their clothing? So the original wampum shells are freshwater clam shells. So you'd go into the waterways, specifically more common along the East Coast, United States. And when you crack open the shell, on the inside there's white and purple. So those are your two main colors. And you can drill down and break these shells into smaller pieces. And then you can use a sand drill or a pin drill and create a physical bead. They're usually oblong in length, like cylindrical, and then they'll be strung into creating patterns for wampum belts. Is that all of our questions so far? All right. Our next clip, we asked Mike to talk a little bit about the objects that shouldn't be seen by people outside of the tribe, because there are some objects that belong solely to the Lenape, and they're the ones who get to look at it, and people who aren't part of that tribe generally don't.
There are some forms of art which tribes will not display. They will not show those things. They have a great deal of meaning among the tribes, among the specific tribe. So we all have certain ways that we express something by a symbol. Those things would be specific to the tribe. It's something we would not show or display to the public or any other person. Those things are specifically just for our tribe and our tribal use only.
So the next question we got in chat was, why do they use bones, like eagle bones, for whistles? So in most Native American religions, it is believed that when you hunt or acquire parts of a living thing, so plant or animal, in order to make something or to eat, it is a gift. So you use all parts of that gift to honor that living thing, its life. And then when those things are no longer viable, they no longer serve that purpose, like a whistle has been worn out, it's worn down, you can't use it anymore, then it's returned back to the earth. That's a large generalization for many cultures, but that's specifically Eastern woodlands. That's very common. Kind of like if you've heard about how buffalo's been treated by plains native cultures, they use every part of the buffalo to respect its life and to make all of their tools, their clothing, and connect with that animal as part of their connection with their environment. Another question we had was, how do they make things out of shells? So to make something out of a shell, let's talk about a bead specifically. So you crack open the shell, and then you crack it into larger pieces, and then shave off the outer exteriors. You can also heat them up really hot, and that'll make it easier to break in a specific, more expectable way. So it breaks more commonly when it's warm than just breaking it at standard temperature. And then you take that large piece of shell and you can use a bone needle, or you can use sand over time, so a friction sand. So you put sand in the little divot, and then you use a bone needle or an awl, and you use friction by twirling it, and it further creates a deeper hole. Or you can use like hot metal, and that can go through easier. So if you have metal needles after the point of contact, that's easier. Certain metals do better than others, so steel would be better for that than, say, silver or brass. Hopefully that explains how to get to the bead version of a shell. You'd also then polish the outside of the bead until it's smooth to the touch, and then you have your little oblong bead. Our next question is, how were bandoliers used? So bandolier bags are a specific bag found most common amongst particular groups of Native Americans. So it's an over-the-shoulder, long bag, kind of like a messenger bag, lengthwise, and it goes diagonal across the body, and then the bag itself has specific designs on it, usually with a flap over that seals, either with a clip or with a pin. And these bags are usually highly decorated with beading or painted motifs, like the tulip bag has those painted areas and then outlined in beads. You could do it like that. Sometimes they're decorated in wampum beads, but that's less common. And bandolier bags can be used to store many different things. They're usually used as like a catch-all bag. Most didn't have specific uses, but you can use them to hold whether, say you're gathering clamshells to make wampum beads. You'd gather all your shells, put them in the bag, and then walk them back to your community so you could start working on them. Other times you can store food in there. You can store pelts. You can store sweetgrass braids. I'm trying to think of the most common things people use them for. I know that there are specific Native stories where seedlings are stored in there. So the actual seeds, and then they fall out of the corner of the bag and get planted along the way. And that explains why certain plants grow in certain patterns. Most bandolier bags were used for whatever people needed them for. They typically didn't have a very specific use unless they were ceremonial, in which case that's more of an explanation for somebody who is an indigenous person to answer that bit. If anyone has any more questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can move on to our next thing. Is there any more answers in the chat? All right. Well, thank you everyone for your questions. This has been wonderful. There is going to be a survey afterwards if you'd like to participate. Our next Curious Conversations will continue next month, and we'll discuss how seasonality played a role in everyday life for people in the 1830s. If you're interested in learning or teaching more about through objects and material culture, we encourage you to check out your local museums, Conner Prairie or otherwise, and to think of the people who use those objects and the meaning of each piece that had to that person, their community, and to their culture. We have one last video for you all today. The Delaware Tribe of Indians recently opened their own museum gallery that teaches people their history through objects from their tribe. We talked to some of the people who helped put it together and their hopes for the future of the gallery.
We've been here all these years, and even today, we still get, well, we didn't know Delaware was here. We didn't know that complex was the Delaware.
We're almost invisible within the community in Bartlesville. It feels that way at times. It's a history that a lot of folks in our region don't even really understand or know.
The museum has been a labor of love for the last 3-4 years, and that's how tonight came about. We finally got her open.
The museum opening is very exciting because now we have a display that really outlines our history, specifically from the beginning of our contact to where we are now. I'm really struck by the early pieces of wampum.
The wampum necklace, when that first arrived, and it was dated back in the 1500s, I thought, wow, this has survived, you know, and now it's here.
It is wonderful to see the photography of so many of our Delaware people. I'm ever so grateful for the team of people that we had, because we are telling the story of so many of our friends and family and community members. We're telling the story of their ancestors.
It's our culture. How else You know, we're losing so much interest with the young if we don't have something like this to keep it going and to teach it. You know, how are they going to learn it?
I'm hoping the younger generation, as they look at these objects that tell about their history, it helps inform them more about their cultural identity, that it is ancient and it is strong and it is something that they can be proud of.
They see the people and the families represented, that will inspire them to delve into their histories and to utilize the resources we have to find their own family histories. And hopefully as we expand, we can incorporate their experiences of being a Delaware tribal member into that museum.
That's another thing that I'm inspired by, that I can be a part of helping to tell our story in our voices, and hopefully that someone will be the next storyteller coming from the voice of the Lenape and not an outsider.
One of our goals is to educate our tribal members first and foremost, and then make sure that the outside community, the rest of the community, understands who we are, where we came from, understands that we did not originally come from Oklahoma, that we are from the eastern woodlands, we are from the East Coast, we are from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, all this area of Lenape-Hocking. So it's really important for us to educate so they can kind of understand our experience and what specifically makes us Lenape.
We'd like to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much for your interest, and please stay curious.